So as part of the Cultivating Tradition video series, as I'm in York with Charlie Buck, I thought we'd have an interesting conversation about something. And one of the things that we've felt quite passionate about over the years is the difference between the way that acupuncture in Chinese medicine is generally perceived and the way that we as practitioners see it. Charlie, you had some thoughts on this.
Yes. There is a professor in the UK who's a professor of the public understanding of science, and his job is to fly around the world and to help guide people into understanding science better so that the world of science can thrive. And I think that it's perhaps time for us to have a similar movement in the UK and to talk about the public understanding of Chinese medicine and acupuncture, because in a sense we've not taken control of our own brand. We haven't really defined in the public eye who we are, what we do, what its value is, what the research is or whatever. We've allowed other people to label us for us. And I think that it's time that we actually began to reflect more deeply on who we are, what we do, and what the value of it really is. And so we have patients who come to us who have no idea really. And I think the fundamental assumption is that we practice alternative medicine. And I would object to that straight away because the problem with that umbrella term that is stuck onto us, so to speak, is that it comes with a whole load of other things that are perhaps less academic, have got less of a historical background, less of a seriousness in a way. I mean, if we look to China to now, we look at the Chinese medicine hospital system, there are something like 4,000 Chinese medicine hospitals in China who specialize in traditional Chinese medicine. And these are large modern hospitals with scanners, with blood labs and cameras on sticks and all the things that you'd expect in a modern hospital, except that the treatments are acupuncture and Chinese medicine. Yeah. And that Chinese medicine service in China alone treats when I looked in 2012, so a bit out of date, at that time treated 430 million people a year. So here the image we have is of a little room behind the health food shop where a geezer, a slightly weird geezer, burns funny smelling herbs or sticks needles in you, and possibly it might be helping you. I mean, so many of our patients that we have treated and have been really pleased with the results, they make that change around. Yep. And then come to accept us. Although not all of them do that. Not all of them do that. And sometimes even when I've noticed clinically that when you treat people and they get marvelously better in the course of treatment, and even then they won't attribute it to what you've done. Yeah.
But I think that we maybe haven't even begun to communicate the real depth of what we do. And so, patients don't necessarily have something to hang it around. We can give them some of the introductory concepts, which have got out there a little bit more, like qi and yin and yang. But actually, if you hear a discussion between two experienced practitioners, they'll talk in a completely different language to each other that the public have maybe never heard. Yeah.
But then, if you go to a dentist, you wouldn't want to be talking about different types of drill, or whether it's a carbide drill or a diamond drill or whatever, or the theory of dentistry. That's not really the most important thing that people are interested in. And actually, the thing that comes along with public understanding is trust. And actually, the thing that we need to foster more is the sense of trust us, we're professional clinicians offering real medicine. And we need to say that, I think, really clearly. And I think trust comes from understanding the people. We don't trust needles, or we don't trust herbs, or we don't trust those tools. People don't trust a dentist because of their drills or their anaesthetic. They trust them because they recognize those people as upstanding professionals. And so that I would like to see more work on in terms of the public understanding of us as a profession, the actual people themselves.
So if there's someone from the public watching this and they don't know much about acupuncture or Chinese medicine, what are some of the things that you think that they might not be aware of that could be quite interesting to them?
I think there's an assumption that goes along with this alternative label, is that it's a fluffy thing, it's a nice thing, but it's not been researched, it's not been proven in any way. Whereas my introduction to acupuncture right back in the 70s was when my medical school neurophysiology professor told me that he thought the most interesting area of research in neurophysiology in 1976 was acupuncture.
Yeah.
So actually, we have a massive database of research trials that show mechanisms and that show clinical benefit.
Yeah.
So the Australian Dr. MacDonald has collected information on this, and he's done a timeline of the research paper count, clinical research papers over the last 12 years. And he looked at physiotherapy, he looked at osteopathy, and he looked at nursing, and he looked at acupuncture. And right at the beginning of that, there were more acupuncture studies, research studies in acupuncture than all the others put together. Like, that's really surprising to most people, that there's more, at that time, 2012 I think that was, there was more research in acupuncture than there was in osteopathy, nursing care and physiotherapy put together. Now, he's graphed it through the years and it changes, but we're still up there as having some of the strongest evidence base.
And that's a very interesting thing, because I actually think that now we've reached a point where actually in the public mind, most people have a sense that acupuncture works, even in the medical profession. But there's an uneasiness over, well, why and how and who's doing it. Absolutely. And I think that clinical evidence is one thing, and there's an abundance of clinical evidence for acupuncture. But I think that there's also something which I think is the most underexplored aspect of this conversation, is the deeper technical language and scientific understanding from the development of Chinese thought. Some people might not be aware that China has a very long and very well documented scientific and technological history. We all have heard of that list of inventions of, the Chinese invented mechanical clock and gunpowder and all of those things. In the 14th century, they had the largest ships, which sailed enormous distances, whole fleet of them. Now, they were leaders in the world at the time.
Yeah.
Clearly, this doesn't come from superstition. To be able to build a ship, it either floats or it sinks, and that's life or death. There's a very important scholar called Joseph Needham, who was an English chemist, and he devoted his life to studying this scientific and technological achievement. He wrote this huge multi-volume series called Science and Technology in China, and one of the editions on medicine. So here's what I think I feel very passionate about is that when you actually understand what the Chinese are talking about, it's incredibly technical, and it's equally technical in how to float a boat as it is to practice Chinese medicine. And it would be very unlikely if all of the science and technology was applied to everything apart from medicine, and the medicine was just this superstitious thing over on the one side. It's not. Some of the greatest minds in China applied themselves to medicine. And I think that's something that's very important and maybe surprising to get across. And I'll just leave you with one thing is, I actually heard a scholar talking about the shipbuilding books, and they would use yin and yang to describe how to make a boat float. If it's too heavy, or if it's made of the wrong material, it's too yin and it will sink. And if it's too yang, it will turn over.
Yes.
And those can be used in very technical.
Exactly. There is the assumption that, again, is pasted onto us that when we say qi, which people translate as energy, that we are automatically being a bit woo-woo and a little bit strange, a little bit shamanic or something. Whereas, in fact, if we go to a chemistry department in a Chinese university, and the Chinese doctor would, if they refer to oxygen, will refer to yang qi. Now, it's a different yang. It's not yang as in yin yang, but actually, they're not thinking in terms of weird philosophical thinking. That is just a normal word in Chinese. It happens to be a word that's very flexible and lots of different meanings. In Chinese linguistics, words do correlate through sound as well.
So when the two words have the same sound, they often
of course,
have
yeah.
a similar meaning
Yes,
too,
yeah.
even if the character's different.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, you just have to look up the word for the sun is Tai Yang, great yang.
Yeah.
The word for shadow is Yinzi or Yin Thing.
Yes.
So it's there throughout the language, and I
Yes.
think that the conceptions of hot and cold, for example. Chinese people, in my experience, find it very surprising that Western people don't know that foods can be warming or cooling.
No.
Yet, when we think about it for a second, we're like, well, we know, yeah, we feel warmer if we have some ginger tea.
Yes, yes.
Or and the funny thing is that we used to know that because mulled wine has herbs like ginger, cardamom, cinnamon, all warming herbs. And when do we drink it? We drink it in the winter.
And we have lamb with mint sauce. Lamb is a hot meat and mint is a cold substance.
Exactly. And so this is something very technical. There couldn't be anything more ground level physics than hot and cold, basically. Yeah.
No. Yeah, one of my favourite examples of that linguistic problem and the contextual issue about the way we understand this medicine is the words feng shui. And they know that that's when you invite somebody with a compass to come and look at your house and tell you whether to put a red bucket in your love corner or whatever is the current interpretation of that tradition. But actually, if you were in a Chinese hospital and the doctor said this patient has feng shui, they're exactly the same characters.
Oh. Okay.
But they mean wind water, they mean acute edema. This patient has acute edema. So what's the connection between acute edema in a hospital setting and a man with a compass telling you to put a red bucket in your love corner? That's the problem that we face, is that actually until you really dive quite deep into Chinese language and culture, you don't really understand the very basics of it in many ways.
And we can go even deeper and say that actually feng shui is also incredibly technical. People don't really understand that this is something that has this equally scientific and technical side.
Exactly, it's not just a love
When
bucket.
we face south,
Yeah.
in the northern hemisphere, you're facing the sun. If you face south, you're going to have more warmth facing your body. Again, it's physics. So there's an aspect of these things, and I think what's confusing is that the medicine of a whole civilization has all of those layers all at once. So it has the kind of ground level, objective, technical layers. And infused in that, it has everything from the symbolic or metaphorical or even the spiritual or metaphysical. And they're all valid. But we see Chinese medicine as one thing from the outside. But if you look at the history of and development of Western medicine, it was also infused with all those layers and dimensions, the symbolic and the spiritual, and it got divided out later on in time and in the Enlightenment period. But perhaps if someone looking from the outside on Western culture looked at Western medicine, and it wasn't so neatly divided out, they'd say, "Oh, this is all the same thing," But actually, when we look at, we're talking about a culture of people who like to write things down. Quite a lot, pretty much over 2,000 years as a continuous written record, vast civilization, vast area, and highly populous. So, and we can't conceive of that in one go. We can't conceive of the fact that there's at least 2 millennia, of continuous medical development within this framework, and our medicine is very young in that respect. It's particularly with the advances that have really made a difference, things like antibiotics and so on, which are really just over a century old, really. So the idea of something evolving over millennia is alien to us. And one thing I like to point out, so in herbal medicine, there are 2 famous schools. One's called the cold school, one's called the warm school. And I like to ask people to guess, how far apart in history do you think that these 2 schools are? And it turns out that these 2 schools of thought are separated by 14 centuries. 14 centuries. So there was one school, and then 14 centuries, another school starts to crop up. And now when we look back in history, it's this school versus that school, but this flattening process where we don't get to see the depth and the learning.
Yes.
And, just a final point to make is something I like to raise to people is, every culture should have roughly an equal proportion of geniuses, right? The distribution, right?
Roughly, I think some cultures have more geniuses.
Possibly, but for sake of argument, let's just say, even if one other culture had half the genius of another, how likely is it that all the geniuses just happen to exist in the Western world and not in the Eastern world?
Exactly, yeah.
And how likely, even if there were geniuses in the Eastern world, which there obviously were, that none of them went into medicine? And the reality is that when you look back, well, the medical history of China is peppered with geniuses. When you're able to read what they wrote in their own words, what you find is something of a level of depth, nuance, and learning, intelligence that it would astound you, effectively.
That's right. But coming back to the public understanding of science and the public understanding of Chinese medicine, you can't have these deep philosophical conversations. We can't have deep cross-cultural, cross-linguistic debates. Somehow we have to have messaging that serves the public understanding without having to read very thick PhD theses. And I think that's the issue, really. So, one way that I came to a conclusion on that was to say we have an explanatory model.
Yeah.
And just say, we have an explanatory model, you're going to struggle to understand it unless you're in our club.
Yeah.
And I think people who challenge us on that are being a bit unfair because, for example, psychiatrists have got their explanatory model, which doesn't really match with science very well, or doesn't really match with normal clinical medicine very well, but still they're respected and accepted for what they are. So they have some explanatory model, and they just stick to that model and use it and hopefully refine it with time, but they're not really trying to justify every single ingredient of it.
Yeah.
So what I think that our task is in the future is to find ways of promoting ourselves as upstanding clinicians doing real medicine. And I think we need to also, when asked about what it is what we're writing on patients' notes, that we say, well, that's just our clinical explanatory model. And a few years ago, when I did my master's, I looked into this because I was using in my master's, I was saying the explanatory model of Chinese medicine, and I'm exploring that, the validity of it. And I thought, oh damn, supposing an external examiner says, well, have you really got an explanatory model? So I looked into that and I found a textbook by a philosopher, by a thinker of medicine in America, an American academic who'd written a thick book called The Logic of Medicine. And I found a definition of a medical model in there. And I went line by line by line, comparing the biomedicine's explanatory model with the Chinese medicine's explanatory model. And actually the Chinese medicine explanatory model fitted better the formal definition of a medical model. So I think we don't need to go much further than that. We say, you don't understand it, you're not in a position to criticise until you've learnt it, and so that we should sidestep that issue of getting into too much depth and too much linguistic complexity.
It's an interesting one, and this would be a good place to kind of draw things to a close. Is that from one perspective, I completely accept what you're saying, but I actually think that there's a very exciting area where we can find a new language to actually, I don't know if we've actually found a language yet.
No.
And I think that we've bits and pieces, and as you say, in academic journals and the brilliant work of linguistics and anthropologists and people like that, it's the seed of it is there. But we haven't started to turn this deeper language out into the world in a way that resonates and connects with people without them having to read long academic papers. So, and I think that, funnily enough, I think that the British Acupuncture Council has a really good place to play in that.
Yes.
With the calibre of our practitioners and thinkers and academics within our community, but also within our communications and our publications, that all of these ideas and these thoughts and our way of articulating ourselves goes into. So I think that's something that we can develop over time, and maybe the world is waiting for it in a sense, because a lot of these things haven't come out yet. Everybody's having acupuncture, so there's a real gap there, I think, that can be filled.
Good.
Great, well, lovely to talk with you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Interesting as always.
And we're going to go and celebrate Richard Blackwell's retirement from the profession, aren't we? Who's contributed so much over the years.
Absolutely. You know, we're really honoured to celebrate with Richard tonight. And look out for more Cultivating Tradition videos coming up soon.
Yeah. Thank you.